See what I mean? Many years ago, I used to go to a Christian house party, and it's a big house in North Wales, and the rooms had names of men of faith of the past, representing different eras of the Christian church: Wycliffe, Tyndale, Calvin, Cromwell, Whitfield, Spurgeon, and Lloyd Jones. Who was the odd one out of those? Now, somebody might say, well, Lloyd Jones, because he was Welsh. But no, he's British, wasn't he? And he actually ministered in London for many years, so he wasn't the odd one out. Calvin, obviously, was French. But what's interesting, of course, is the inclusion of Cromwell in that list as the representative of that 17th century, many men of God, women of God too, but we look back and we see the Westminster Divines and those who were called Puritans. And why did my friend pick Cromwell? Well, I think as we go through, we might see why that was. He was the only one of those men who names adorned those doors on the dormitories, who wasn't a minister in terms of being a pastor of the people. He was a politician, of course, as many other things too, representative of the Puritans. But it's very important that we understand about Cromwell and his significance, which is why we've called this talk The Importance of Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans, who were they? Well, of course, we could say many things about them. I don't want to go into too much detail, but really they wanted to get back to the New Testament. They wanted the life of the church, of Jesus Christ, the Christians. They wanted the nation, as far as was possible, to conform to the New Testament. They wanted purity of worship, which is why they got that nickname, the Puritans, amongst other things. So we have this link with the Reformation, with Cromwell. He was born only 81 years after Luther's 95 Theses on the 25th of April, 1599. But before we look at his life a little bit, there's one thing I wanted just to mention. That was, there's two men in church history which have been most vilified, in my view. One is Calvin and the other is Cromwell. Unfortunately, they've actually suffered at the hands of Christians too. And I want to address that in particular. So we're looking at this man, Oliver Cromwell, who stands, hopefully with us, in the Reformed tradition. Those who realize that the Bible is the Word of God and is our authority. And we need to hold to it like they did in their day. So, 25th of April, 1599. Cromwell's father was of modest means, but still a member of the landed gentry. He had land, and in 1654, Cromwell said, "I was by birth a gentleman, living neither in considerable height nor yet in obscurity." Quite an ordinary person, but with some means. He married Elizabeth Borgia in 1620, and they had 9 children born between 1621 and 1638, 5 boys and 4 girls. The eldest, Robert, died while away at school in his late teens. Oliver Jr., the second child, died of typhoid fever in his early 20s, serving in the army during the Civil War. And James, his youngest son, died in infancy. In 1628, Cromwell was elected to Parliament as a member for Huntingdon, and that was for a year or so. Around 1631, he seems to have gone through a spiritual crisis. By the way, I'm basing my talk on the Wikipedia page, actually. I was looking for something that had the sort of facts laid out, and that seemed to be the best source. So if you want to see the expanded version, you can start with Wikipedia. He speaks of this spiritual crisis in these terms in a letter that he wrote in 1638. He describes himself as being the chief of sinners and his calling as among the congregation of the firstborn. The letter's language, says Wikipedia, and particularly the inclusion of numerous biblical quotations, shows Cromwell's belief that he was saved from his sins by God's mercy, and also indicates his religiously independent beliefs. Chief among them, that the Reformation had not gone far enough. That's the note of the Puritans there. He's following them in that. That much of England was still living in sin, and that Roman Catholic beliefs and practices must be fully removed from the church. Interesting how strong they were on that matter. But by 1634, he was thinking of emigrating to America, but was prevented from doing so. After dissolving the 1628 Parliament, Charles I ruled without Parliament for the next 11 years. When Charles faced the Scottish Rebellion in the Bishops' Wars, lack of funds forced him to call a Parliament again in 1640. He didn't want to, but he had to. And so Cromwell was returned to this Parliament as member for Cambridge, but it only lasted 3 weeks and became known as the Short Parliament. Cromwell moved his family from Ely to London around this time. But then a second Parliament was called later the same year and became known as the Long Parliament. And Cromwell was again returned as the member for Cambridge. What we find at this time is a great battle. Now, it's very complex, not going to go into too much detail, but there were terrible divisions in Parliament, in the country. The king held to the divine right of kings. He was put there by God. What he said was law, and it should not be argued with. And of course, the Puritans disagreed with that quite strongly, and they made representation time and time again to change this. The king seemed to favour whoever would support this view. The Church of England was becoming more and more nominal, Arminian, and ritualistic. In other words, it was going in the opposite direction to the direction the Puritans wanted to take it. So things were really coming to a head. Parliament, populated by Puritans, wanted to reform and become a modern democracy. The tensions mounted. From this booklet by Dr. Clifford, I'll just read some of his words. He said, "The religious differences determined the attitude of many towards the question of the control of the armed forces. Should it be by king or parliament? Law and custom answered in favour of the king. But if the king had the power of the sword, how much longer would he respect concessions recently made? His answer sealed his future. On the 4th of January 1642, supported by troops, he rashly and illegally went to the Commons to arrest Pym, Hampden and 3 other members. Had the birds not flown, bloodshed would have resulted there and then." And so in the end, failure to resolve the issues before the Long Parliament led to armed conflict between Parliament and Charles in late 1642, the beginning of the English Civil War. Now the issue was, what do you support? That's not an easy question to answer. Is your opposition to tyranny greater than an accepted principle? That it's the monarch who is given that position by God and the offspring of him will continue in succession. Which is the greater principle? And so what happened? Friends and families were divided. You go down, you probably know, you go down near Stonehouse and you've got King Stanley and Leonard Stanley. One supporting the king and the other supporting Parliament. This, of course, is how the devil works. Divide and conquer. King versus Parliament. But now, today, we have Parliament versus the people, I would argue. Listen to what Cromwell said at the time, he said, "I'd rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than that which you call a gentleman is nothing else." Character. What do you support? What do you want? Who are you going to follow? These are not light questions. Another great quote of Cromwell, of course, was this: "Put your faith in God and keep your powder dry." That was his instruction to his troops. Firstly, put your faith in God, but also do what is necessary, practically. And so war broke out. By the time of the Battle of Marston Moor in July 1644, Cromwell had risen to the rank of Lieutenant General of Horse in the Earl of Manchester's army. His cavalry's success in breaking the ranks of the Royalist cavalry and then attacking their infantry from the rear at Marston Moor was a major factor in the parliamentarian victory. Cromwell fought at the head of his troops in the battle and was slightly wounded in the neck, stepping away briefly to receive treatment, but returning to help secure the victory. We see something of his character there. He said on this battle, "Truly England and the Church of God hath had a great favour from the Lord in this great victory given us." And a bit later on the same year he said this: "We study the glory of God and the honour and liberty of Parliament, for which we unanimously fight without seeking our own interests. I profess I could never satisfy myself on the justness of this war, but from the authority of the Parliament to maintain itself in its rights. And in this cause I hope to prove myself an honest man and single-hearted." He was devoted to a cause. Partly in response to the failure to capitalise on their victory at Marston Moor, Parliament passed what they called the Self-Denying Ordinance in early 1645. This forced members of the House of Commons and the Lords, such as the Earl of Manchester, to choose between civil office and military command. Which were you going to have? All of them chose to renounce their military positions, except Cromwell, whose commission was extended and was allowed to remain in Parliament. I think this was due to his prowess on the battlefield. What we see is, as the Civil War brings Cromwell to the fore, and his gifts are then used by the Lord. In a similar way we see with Churchill. Churchill really only came to the fore and is the hero that we perhaps look up to because of the war and how he was able to lead the nation at that time. This ordinance also decreed that the army be remodelled on a national basis, replacing the old county associations. And Cromwell contributed significantly to these military reforms. In April 1645, the new model army finally took to the field, with Sir Thomas Fairfax in command and Cromwell as Lieutenant General of Cavalry and second in command. Before the Battle of Naseby in 1645, he said this: "I could not be riding out alone about my business, but smile out to God in praises, in assurance of victory, because God would, by things that are not, bring to naught things that are." At this critical battle, the new model army smashed the king's major army. Cromwell led his wing with great success at Naseby, again routing the royalist cavalry. This effectively ended the king's hopes of victory, and the subsequent parliamentarian campaigns involved taking the remaining fortified royalist positions in the west of England, Bristol particularly. Charles I surrendered to the Scots on the 5th of May 1646, effectively ending the First English Civil War. Cromwell and Fairfax took the royalists' formal surrender at Oxford in June. So June 1646, the First Civil War comes to an end. Cromwell, in contrast to Fairfax, had no formal training in military tactics and followed the common practice of ranging his cavalry in three ranks and pressing forward, relying on impact rather than firepower. His strengths were an instinctive ability to lead and train his men and his moral authority. In a war fought mostly by amateurs, these strengths were significant and most likely contributed to the discipline of his cavalry. He also introduced close order cavalry formations with troopers riding knee to knee, very, very close. This was an innovation in England at the time and a major factor in his success. He kept his troops close together after skirmishes where they gained superiority, rather than allowing them to chase opponents off the battlefield, which was the common practice. This meant that they could quickly react to developments in the battle. This style of command was decisive at both Marston Moor and Naseby. By 1647, the parliamentarians were split over the issue of the king. A majority in both houses pushed for a settlement that would pay off the Scottish army, disband much of the new model army, and restore Charles I in return for a Presbyterian settlement of the church. This was a problem. Cromwell rejected the Scottish model of Presbyterianism. He was an independent, which threatened to replace one authoritarian hierarchy with another. The new model army, radicalised by Parliament's failure to pay the wages it was owed, petitioned against these changes, but the Commons declared the petition unlawful. So now you see things bubbling up again in a different way. In May 1647, Cromwell was sent to the army's headquarters at Saffron Walden to negotiate with them, but failed to agree terms. The cavalry took matters into their own hands and seized the king from imprisonment. Cromwell was eager to find out what conditions the king would agree to if his authority was restored, so he met with him. The king appeared to be willing to compromise. So Cromwell employed his son-in-law, Henry Ireton, to draw up proposals for a constitutional settlement. But the army was not satisfied, and the so-called Putney debates broke up. All this ended up with the Scots on the side of the king, hoping he would give them what they wanted. The king tried to regain power by force of arms. Cromwell put down a royalist uprising in South Wales, then marched north to deal with pro-royalist Scottish army who had invaded England. At Preston, in sole command for the first time, with an army of 9,000, he won a decisive victory against an army twice as large. And so we see we're now in the midst of a second civil war. During 1648, Cromwell's letters and speeches started to become heavily based on biblical imagery, many of them meditations on the meaning of particular passages. For example, after the Battle of Preston, study of Psalm 17 and 105 led him to tell Parliament that they, quoting, they that are implacable and will not leave troubling the land may be speedily destroyed out of the land. In a letter to Oliver St. John in September 1648, he urged him to read Isaiah 8, in which the kingdom falls and only the godly survive. On 4 occasions in letters in 1648, he referred to the story of Gideon's defeat of the Midianites. Here we see Cromwell's faith coming to the fore. Parliament's decision to engage in negotiations with the king convinced him that God had spoken against both the king and Parliament as lawful authorities. For Cromwell, the army was now God's chosen instrument. The episode shows Cromwell's firm belief in God's providence, that God was actively directing the affairs of the world. During the civil wars, Cromwell believed that he was God's instrument, and he interpreted victories as indicators of God's approval and defeats as signs that God was pointing him in another direction. Providence comes up again and again and again in the way that he approached these things. In December 1648, Pride's Purge removed all the MPs who did not support the army. Thus weakened, the remaining body of MPs, known as the Rump Parliament, agreed that Charles should be tried for treason. Cromwell was still in the north of England, dealing with royalist resistance when these events took place, but then returned to London, and he became a determined supporter of those pushing for the king's trial and execution, believing that killing Charles was the only way to end the civil wars. He started off, if you see the Cromwell film starring Richard Harris from 1970, you can see that this is the case. The idea of killing the king was repugnant to Cromwell, but events proved otherwise, and he changed his mind about that. He went really from one extreme to the other. He supported Thomas Brooks, that's Brooke, not the Puritan minister, but another Thomas Brooke. Thomas Brooks' address based on Numbers 35:33, the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. So that was what convinced Cromwell. Charles' death warrant was signed by 59 of the trying court's members, including Cromwell. Fairfax refused to sign. Charles I was executed on the 30th of January 1649. So we're just going to pause at this point and ask a question. Should they have beheaded the king? It's hard to find biblical warrant for it. I would think that good men would be divided, just as they were in Cromwell's day. After all, it's easy to be wise in hindsight. It's easy to look back and say, oh yeah, I'd be on that side or that side. But it now seems pointless in view of the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, who had learned nothing. But how are we to hold kings accountable? I'm just throwing these questions out. I've not got answers for you. It seems significant that our king is Charles III, does it not? After the king's execution, a republic was declared known as the Commonwealth of England. The Rump Parliament exercised both executive and legislative powers. The Royalists, meanwhile, had regrouped in Ireland, having signed a treaty with the Irish known as Confederate Catholics. This is the king, and he's basically reaching out to whoever will support him. Even though he's now gone, this agreement is still standing. In March, the Rump chose Cromwell to command a campaign against them. His leading of the Irish campaign was a massive success in military terms. But, you probably know, he's ever tainted by the massacres at Drogheda and Wexford. So I wanted just to break off again at this point and commend to you this book by Tom Riley, Cromwell, An Honourable Enemy. Is that right? Is Tom Riley correct? Well, listen to what he says. He says, as author of this book, I feel that many historians in Ireland are not ready yet for an honourable Cromwell, nor indeed are the people of Ireland. I thought that I would change the history books and public opinion about this much maligned historical figure by publishing the truth about Cromwell's Irish campaign. The reaction among the under-40s on the whole was good, but among historians and the over-40s it was bad. They can't seem to accept that an amateur could discover such a fundamental flaw in Irish history. That is, that neither Cromwell or his men ever engaged in the killing of any unarmed civilians throughout his entire 9-month campaign. The facts are there for all to see. But in Ireland, the past is still the present here, and we must have our English hate figures despite the truth. How sad is that? This is a layman speaking. He says this, I come from Drogheda, Ireland. I was born there. I live there. I never left the parish. Drogheda will forever be associated with Oliver Cromwell. It is the biggest stain on his career, as he's alleged to have massacred thousands of its unarmed inhabitants, babies, toddlers, teenagers, pensioners, grannies, granddads, etc., etc. But I've discovered that this is complete nonsense, and my books have proved this. Essentially, he managed to exclude unarmed civilians from the military conflict, although a handful may have died as a result of collateral damage in both Drogheda and Wexford. However, I constantly get pushback from people everywhere who often disagree vehemently, including historians who should know better. Opinions are not facts. My work has not yet been seriously challenged by any historian anywhere. In times yet to come, my books will stand out as the primary work that played a central role in the rehabilitation of Oliver Cromwell's murderous reputation in Ireland. I've made it my life's ambition to try to right this wrong, this historical miscarriage of justice, to overturn the erroneous verdict of history. While no doubt an impact has been made, to date my non-fiction books have essentially failed to penetrate the wall of tradition and myth that promote Cromwell as a genocidal maniac. A book on the Irish school curriculum today, entitled History in Focus by Dan Sheedy and published as recently as 2018 by C.J. Fallon, states that at Drogheda, Cromwell massacred 3,500 inhabitants and at Wexford 4,000 people. This is complete drivel and as bad as it gets. The fact that I failed second-level history, got an F, and yet I discovered a fundamental flaw in the teaching of Irish history says something inconvenient about Ireland today. It says that generations of Irish historians have perhaps purposely failed to accept, and, with few exceptions, continue to fail to accept, that Oliver Cromwell was fundamentally a decent guy and a product of his time. Cromwell was framed. That's his conclusion. Get over it. Can we please blame the right people for the atrocities they committed and not an honourable man who is innocent of the charges against him, as I've now proved? So I've taken my time about this because this obviously is really, really important. That the reputation of this man is actually false. And when you look at the other things that he did, and you listen to his speeches and read his letters, it doesn't match. And that ought to be the first indicator that something's wrong. What we're talking about here, of course, is breaking the ninth commandment. And unfortunately, it's still taking a pounding this very day. Sadly, Christians have got in on the act. They write and misrepresent the likes of Calvin and Cromwell, as I've said. It's basically a logical fallacy, an ad hominem attack. Don't like what they stand for? Attack the person. The ninth commandment, of course, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour, even if he's thine enemy. Cromwell was away on campaign from the middle of 1649 until 1651. The various factions in Parliament began to fight amongst themselves, with the king now gone as their common cause. Cromwell tried to galvanise the rump into setting dates for new elections, uniting the three kingdoms under one polity, and to put in place a broad-brush, tolerant national church. All the time he's pushing for biblical reformation, to have the Bible as our standard in our lives, in the church, in the nation. Ultimately, he wanted the rump to establish a caretaker government in April 1653 of 40 members drawn from the rump and the army, and then to abdicate. But the rump returned to debating its own bill for a new government, ignoring his wishes for a government by the people and for the people. Cromwell was so angered by this that he cleared the chamber and dissolved the parliament by force on the 20th of April 1653, supported by about 40 musketeers. Which is interesting because it seems very similar to what the king did and actually caused the Civil War. But this shows the regard that Cromwell was held in, and the fact that sometimes its force of personality wins the day. I'm not advocating that as a way to run a country, by the way. This is what is a very, it's interesting to read the speech that he gave, but I'll just give you the meaty bit, which you probably know. You have sat too long here for any good you've been doing. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go. You're welcome to go to the House of Parliament and say that, by the way, and say, oh, there's the statue of Cromwell, and this is what he would say to you lot sitting today. After the dissolution of the rump, power passed temporarily to a council that debated what form the constitution should take. In his speech at the opening of the assembly on the 4th of July 1653, Cromwell thanked God's providence that he believed had brought England to this point and set out their divine mission. Truly God hath called you to this work by, I think, as wonderful providences as ever passed upon the sons of men in so short a time. This parliament was known as the Bare Bones Parliament, but there were fears that it could be hijacked by radicals, and that was something they feared. This is always a problem. You look at the government that we have, and you might be very negative toward it. What are you going to replace it with? That's always a difficult question. This led to its members voting to dissolve it on the 12th of December 1653. Cromwell wanted an elected parliament to rule and ended up ruling alone. After the dissolution of the bare-bones Parliament, John Lambert put forward a new constitution known as the Instrument of Government. It made Cromwell Lord Protector for life to undertake the chief magistracy and administration of government. Cromwell was sworn in as Lord Protector on the 16th December 1653, with a ceremony in which he wore plain black clothing rather than any monarchical regalia. Cromwell had two key objectives of Lord Protector. The first was healing and settling the nation after the chaos of the civil wars, which meant establishing a stable form for the new government to take. This was very difficult. Cromwell declared to the first Protectorate Parliament that government by one man and a parliament is fundamental. But in practice, social priorities took precedence over forms of government. Such forms were, he said, but dross and dung in comparison to Christ. The social priorities did not include any meaningful attempt to reform the social order. Cromwell declared a nobleman, a gentleman, a yeoman, the distinction of these, that is a good interest of the nation and a great one. Small-scale reform, such as that carried out on the judicial system, were outweighed by attempts to restore order to English politics. Direct taxation was reduced slightly, and peace was made with the Dutch, ending the First Anglo-Dutch War. Cromwell's second objective, which perhaps was the more important one, was spiritual and moral reform. He aimed to restore liberty of conscience and promote both outward and inward godliness throughout England. Just think of the history at this time. I know we are going through tumultuous times right now, but think of how we can walk out in peace and these kind of things. Where have these come from? Most of the world is not like that. Well, you can look to Cromwell, and of course you can look to the Bible. The Bible is the source. Cromwell was the instrument. Listen to what he said when he dissolved the first Protectorate Parliament. Weeds and nettles, briars and thorns have thriven under your shadow. Dissettlement and division, discontentment and dissatisfaction, together with real dangers to the whole. He wanted them to govern fairly and justly and righteously. And he would get very cross if they didn't do that. He said this: God has brought us where we are to consider the work we may do in the world as well as at home. He had a broader vision than just the nation. Later on he said this: in every government there must be somewhat fundamental, somewhat like a Magna Charta. Interesting he said that. That should be standing and unalterable. That Parliament should not make themselves perpetual is a fundamental. Ruling for the benefit of the people, not for themselves. That was the problem with Charles I. He said this: I desire not to keep my place in this government an hour longer than I may preserve England in its just rights and may protect the people of God in such a just liberty of their consciences. He wanted government